Welcome to Dark Night. I'm here to guide you through the shadows tonight. I know many of you come here to drift away into sleep, so before we begin our journey, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Dark Night for more eerie tales. Tonight you'll find comfort in the black screen and the gentle rain sounds that will accompany us. Get comfortable, pull your blankets close, and let your mind wander into the darkness. I have 3 unsettling stories to share with you. Tales that will dance at the edge of your dreams. So close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the whispers of the night carry you away. Story 1, The Night Shift Cleaner. This story comes from someone who worked the graveyard shift at an old office building downtown. She never told me her real name, but she called herself Sarah for this telling. What happened to her during those lonely midnight hours? Well, you'll understand why she quit without notice. Sarah had been cleaning office buildings for almost 15 years when she took the job at the Meridian Tower. It was one of those glass and steel monuments from the 1970s. 32 floors of corporate cubicles and conference rooms that stood like a dark finger against the city skyline. The pay was better than her previous jobs, and the work seemed simple enough. Clean the offices on floors 28 through 32 between midnight and 6 in the morning. No people around, just her, the silence and the endless rows of empty desks. The first few weeks went smoothly. Sarah would arrive at 11:45, check in with the security guard in the lobby, and take the elevator up to the 28th floor. She had her routine down to a science. Start at the east end, work her way through each office methodically, vacuum the carpets, empty the trash bins, dust the surfaces, and clean the windows. The building was old but well maintained, and the offices were typically left in reasonable condition by the day staff. But it was during her 3rd week that Sarah first noticed something unusual. She was cleaning a corner office on the 30th floor when she heard what sounded like typing, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of fingers on a keyboard, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Sarah paused, her cloth hovering over the mahogany desk, and listened carefully. The typing continued for about 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. Sarah told herself it must have been the building settling, or perhaps pipes in the walls. Old buildings made all sorts of noises, especially at night when the temperature dropped and the materials contracted. She finished cleaning the office and moved on, but the sound had left her feeling slightly unsettled. The next night, the typing happened again. This time, Sarah was on the 29th floor, working in what appeared to be an accounting department. Rows of identical desks stretched out before her, each one equipped with a computer terminal and neat stacks of papers. She was emptying a wastebasket when the typing began. It was clearer this time, more distinct. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere on the same floor, maybe 2 or 3 offices away. Sarah set down the trash bag and walked slowly in the direction of the sound. Her cleaning cart squeaked softly as she pushed it down the carpeted hallway, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The typing continued, steady and purposeful, as if someone were working late into the night. But as Sarah approached what she thought was the source of the sound, it stopped again. She stood in the hallway for several minutes, listening to the silence. The air conditioning system whispered through the vents above her head, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the faint hum of the elevator machinery. But no typing. No indication that anyone else was in the building. Sarah checked every office on that floor. Each one was dark and empty, the computer screens black, the chairs pushed neatly under the desks. Everything was exactly as it should be for a building that had been vacant since 6 o'clock that evening. The security guard, a heavy-set man in his 60s named Frank, assured Sarah that she was the only person in the building after midnight. The electronic keycard system would have registered if anyone else had entered, and Frank made his rounds every 2 hours to check the floors. No one else had access to the upper floors during Sarah's shift, but the typing continued. Not every night, but often enough that Sarah began to expect it. Sometimes it would last for just a minute or two. Other times it would go on for nearly half an hour. The sound always seemed to be coming from a different location, and Sarah could never pinpoint exactly which office it was emanating from. It was as if the source moved around the building, following some pattern that she couldn't understand. Sarah tried to rationalize what she was hearing. Maybe it was the heating system. Maybe it was electrical interference from the computers even though they were turned off. Maybe it was sound carrying from another building nearby, somehow finding its way through the ventilation system. But deep down she knew that none of these explanations felt right. The sound was too distinct, too deliberate. Someone or something was typing in that building during the dark hours when Sarah was supposed to be alone. After a month on the job, Sarah decided to investigate more thoroughly. She brought a small flashlight with her and made a point of checking every office more carefully when she heard the typing. On a Thursday night in November, her persistence finally paid off. She was on the 31st floor cleaning a row of offices that belonged to what appeared to be a law firm. The nameplates on the doors read Martinez Associates, and the offices were filled with legal books, filing cabinets, and the usual corporate furniture. Sarah was wiping down a conference table when the typing began again, closer than it had ever been before. This time she was certain the sound was coming from the office directly across the hall. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and walked quickly to the door. The nameplate read David Martinez, Senior Partner. Through the frosted glass window she could see that the office was dark, but the typing was definitely coming from inside. Sarah tried the door handle. It was locked, as all the offices were supposed to be, but the typing continued, steady and rhythmic, as if whoever was inside was completely absorbed in their work. Sarah pressed her ear to the door and listened carefully. Along with the typing, she could now hear other sounds. The squeak of a chair, the rustle of papers, and what sounded like someone clearing their throat occasionally. Sarah knocked softly on the door. The typing stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She waited for nearly 5 minutes, but the office remained silent. When she tried the door handle again, it was still locked. The next morning, Sarah called in sick. She spent the day researching the Meridian Tower online, looking for any information about the building's history that might explain what she was experiencing. What she found made her stomach turn cold. David Martinez had indeed been a senior partner in the law firm that occupied the 31st floor. But David Martinez had been dead for 3 years. He had died of a heart attack while working late one night, slumped over his desk with his fingers still resting on his keyboard. The law firm had moved out of the building 6 months after his death, and the 31st floor had been vacant ever since. But according to the building directory that Sarah checked every night, Martinez Associates was still listed as the tenant for that floor. And according to her work orders, she was still supposed to clean those offices as if they were occupied. Sarah almost quit that night. She sat in her car in the parking garage beneath the building, staring up at the darkened windows of the 31st floor, trying to decide whether to go home and never come back. The money was good, better than anything else she was likely to find, and she had bills to pay and a daughter to support. But the thought of spending another night alone with whatever was typing in David Martinez's office made her hands shake. In the end, necessity won over fear. Sarah took the elevator up to the 28th floor and began her shift as usual. But she made a promise to herself that she would stay away from the 31st floor that night. Let the ghosts or whatever they were keep their offices dusty for one more day. She managed to avoid the 31st floor for almost 3 hours. But as she was finishing up the 30th floor, she heard something that changed everything. It wasn't typing this time. It was voices. Muffled conversation was drifting down from the floor above. Sarah could hear at least 2 people talking, their words indistinct but their tones animated as if they were having an important business discussion. There were occasional bursts of laughter, the sound of chairs scraping across the floor, and what sounded like papers being shuffled. Sarah stood at the bottom of the stairwell that led to the 31st floor, listening to the sounds of what appeared to be a normal office environment. It was 2:30 in the morning, and the 31st floor was supposed to be completely vacant, but it sounded like a full staff was working up there, conducting meetings and handling business as if it were the middle of a weekday afternoon. Against her better judgment, Sarah climbed the stairs. The sounds grew louder as she approached the 31st floor, and she could now make out individual words and phrases. Someone was discussing a case, mentioning court dates and depositions. Another voice was talking about filing deadlines and client meetings. The conversation sounded completely normal, completely professional, and completely impossible. Sarah pushed open the stairwell door and stepped into the hallway of the 31st floor. The sound stopped immediately. The silence that replaced them was so sudden and complete that Sarah felt as if her ears had suddenly gone deaf. She stood in the hallway, listening to her own breathing, waiting for some indication of the people who had been talking just moments before. Nothing. The 31st floor was as dark and empty as it had been every other night. Sarah walked slowly down the hallway, checking each office. Every door was locked. Every office was dark. There was no sign that anyone had been there, but as Sarah turned to leave, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The carpet in the hallway showed clear impressions where multiple people had been walking. Footprints in the thick pile, leading from office to office as if a full staff had been moving around the floor just minutes before she arrived. Sarah ran. She abandoned her cleaning cart, took the elevator down to the lobby, and told Frank, the security guard, that she was feeling sick and needed to go home early. Frank barely looked up from his newspaper, waving her toward the exit with a dismissive gesture. But Sarah couldn't stay away. The money was too good and her financial situation was too desperate. She returned the next night, determined to finish her shift and collect her paycheck no matter what was happening on the 31st floor. This time she brought a camera, a small digital camera that she could use to document whatever was happening in the building. If there really were people working in those offices at night, she would have proof. And if there weren't, well, at least she would have evidence of her own sanity. The night started normally enough. Sarah worked through the 28th and 29th floors without incident, but as she was preparing to move up to the 30th floor, she heard the elevator moving. The floors were indicated by lights above the elevator doors in the hallway, and Sarah watched as the elevator rose from the lobby to the 15th floor, then the 20th, then the 25th. The elevator stopped at the 31st floor. Sarah heard the doors open with their familiar chime, followed by the sound of multiple footsteps entering the hallway above. Voices began almost immediately, the same professional conversation she had heard the night before. But this time Sarah was ready. She took the stairs up to the 31st floor, camera in hand. As she pushed open the stairwell door, the sound stopped again, just as they had before. But this time, Sarah was quick enough to capture what she saw. The hallway was filled with a soft bluish light that seemed to have no source. And in that light, Sarah could see transparent figures moving through the offices, men and women in business suits carrying briefcases and folders, walking through the hallway as if it were a normal workday. They paid no attention to Sarah, continuing their conversations and their work as if she weren't there. Sarah raised her camera and took several pictures. Through the viewfinder, she could see the figures clearly, their faces serious and focused, their movements purposeful and businesslike. But when she looked at the camera's display screen to check the photos she had taken, there was nothing there. Just empty hallways and dark offices. The transparent figures continued their work for nearly an hour. Sarah watched as they moved in and out of offices, held meetings around conference tables, and conducted what appeared to be perfectly normal business activities. Occasionally, one of them would sit down at a desk and begin typing, producing the sounds that Sarah had been hearing for weeks. But the most unsettling part was when Sarah realized that she recognized one of the figures. The man working in the corner office, the one with David Martinez's nameplate on the door, looked exactly like the photographs Sarah had found online. David Martinez, dead for 3 years, was sitting at his desk, working late into the night just as he had been doing when his heart finally gave out. Sarah watched until the figures began to fade as dawn approached. One by one, they became less distinct. Their conversations grew quieter and their movements became slower. By 5:30 in the morning, they had vanished entirely, leaving behind only empty offices and the lingering scent of coffee that hadn't been brewed by anyone living. Sarah finished her shift mechanically, cleaning the remaining floors in a daze. She never spoke to Frank about what she had seen, and she never tried to take pictures again. She knew that no camera could capture what was happening on the 31st floor. Just as no rational explanation could account for the phantom law firm that continued to conduct business long after its senior partner had died at his desk. She worked at the Meridian Tower for 6 more months. The nightly activities on the 31st floor became as routine as emptying trash bins and vacuuming carpets. Sarah learned to time her work so that she would be on the 31st floor during the hours when the ghostly staff was most active. She found their presence oddly comforting in a way. They were just people trying to finish their work even if they happened to be dead. But Sarah never got used to typing. Even though she now understood what was causing it, the sound still made her skin crawl. The steady tap-tap-tap of David Martinez's fingers on his keyboard, continuing the work that death had interrupted, was a reminder that some obligations transcend the boundaries between life and death. Sarah finally quit when the building was sold to a new management company. The new owners planned to renovate the 31st floor and lease it to a tech startup. Sarah wondered what would happen when construction workers arrived to tear down the offices where David Martinez and his colleagues continued their eternal workday. But that wasn't her problem anymore. Sarah had found a new job, cleaning a small medical building where the only sounds at night were the hum of refrigeration units and the occasional call of a night bird outside the windows. No typing, no phantom conversations, no transparent figures conducting business meetings in offices that had been vacant for years. Sometimes, though Sarah still thinks about the Meridian Tower, she wonders if David Martinez is still there, still working late into the night, still trying to catch up on all the cases he left unfinished when his heart stopped beating. She wonders if the new tenants on the 31st floor hear typing in the middle of the night, and if they're wise enough to leave well enough alone. Because some deadlines, Sarah learned, are truly deadlines, and some work continues long after the worker has clocked out for the final time. If you're listening now, Where are you from? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know who's joining me in these dark hours. Now, let's slip into our next tale. One that comes from the deep woods where cell towers can't reach and civilization feels like a distant memory. Factory 2, the house on Millfield Road. This story was sent to me by someone who goes by Emma, though I suspect that's not her real name. She lives in rural Pennsylvania now, but the events she describes happened when she was 24 and working as a real estate photographer. Her job was simple: take pictures of houses for sale, make them look inviting for potential buyers. But the house on Millfield Road, that house taught Emma that some properties should never be sold to anyone. Emma had been photographing houses for almost 2 years when she got the assignment that would change everything. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when her supervisor called with details about a property that had just been listed. An old farmhouse about 45 minutes outside the city, sitting on 12 acres of overgrown land. The realtor wanted the photos done quickly, before the autumn light started fading too early in the day. The address was 4247 Millfield Road, and Emma's GPS had trouble finding it. She drove down increasingly narrow country roads, past abandoned barns and fields that had returned to wilderness, until she finally spotted a weathered mailbox with the numbers barely visible through rust and decay. A gravel driveway wound through a stand of maple trees, their leaves brilliant red and orange in the morning sun. The house appeared suddenly as Emma rounded a bend in the driveway. It was larger than she had expected. A 2-story Victorian farmhouse with wraparound porches and tall, narrow windows. The white paint was peeling badly and several of the shutters hung at odd angles, but the basic structure seemed sound. Ivy had claimed most of the east wall, and the front porch sagged slightly under the weight of accumulated leaves and debris. Emma parked near the front steps and gathered her equipment. Her camera bag, tripod, and the folder containing the lockbox code and property details. According to the listing sheet, the house had been vacant for almost 3 years, ever since the previous owner had passed away and left the property to a niece who lived in California. The niece wanted to sell quickly and had priced the house well below market value to attract buyers. The lockbox was attached to the front door, and Emma punched in the code she had been given. The key turned easily in the old lock, and the front door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo through the empty house. Emma stepped inside and was immediately struck by how well preserved everything appeared to be. The previous owner had clearly taken excellent care of the place. The hardwood floors were in beautiful condition. The crown molding was intact and the wallpaper, though dated, was clean and undamaged. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, with an underlying mustiness that was typical of houses that had been closed up for several years. Emma began her work in the living room, setting up her tripod and adjusting her camera settings for the available light. She had developed a routine over her 2 years on the job, and she moved efficiently from room to room, capturing the angles and features that would make the house appealing to potential buyers. Wide shots to show the spaciousness of the rooms, detailed shots of interesting architectural elements, and exterior shots that emphasized the property's rural charm. But as Emma worked her way through the house, she began to notice things that seemed unusual. Small details that didn't quite fit with the story she had been told about the property. In the kitchen, for instance, there was a coffee mug sitting on the counter next to the sink. The mug contained what appeared to be coffee, though when Emma looked closer, she realized it was just a dark stain at the bottom. But the placement was odd. The mug sat in the exact center of the counter, as if someone had carefully positioned it there before leaving. In the dining room, one of the chairs had been pulled out from the table, angled as if someone had just stood up and walked away. The other chairs were pushed neatly under the table, but this one sat askew, disrupting the symmetry of the room. And in the master bedroom upstairs, the bed was unmade. Not messily unmade as if someone had just climbed out and rushed off to work, but deliberately unmade. The covers were folded back in a precise triangle, and the pillows were fluffed and arranged as if someone had prepared the bed for an arrival rather than a departure. Emma told herself that these details were probably the result of the realtor or someone from the property management company preparing the house for showing. But something about the arrangements felt too personal, too intimate, as if the house's previous occupant had stepped out just moments before Emma's arrival and planned to return shortly. The feeling grew stronger as Emma continued her work. In the study, a book lay open on the desk, its pages yellowed with age, but the text still clearly readable. It was a volume of poetry, and Emma could see that someone had underlined certain passages in pencil. The handwriting in the margins was neat and feminine, with small notes and observations about the verses. Emma photographed the study from several angles, but she found herself drawn back to the open book. She leaned closer to read the underlined passage. It was from a poem by Emily Dickinson, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me." The words had been underlined multiple times, and in the margin, someone had written, "How true this is," in the same neat handwriting. A chill ran down Emma's spine, but she told herself it was just the October air. Old houses were always cold, and this one had been closed up for years. She continued with her photography, working her way through the remaining upstairs rooms. The second bedroom appeared to have been used as a guest room. The furniture was covered with white sheets and the air was thick with dust. But when Emma pulled back one of the sheets to photograph an antique dresser, she found that the surface underneath was completely clean, as if it had been dusted just days before. The third bedroom was the strangest of all. It was completely empty except for a single rocking chair positioned in front of the window. The chair was old but well maintained, its wooden surfaces polished to a warm glow. It sat facing the window, which looked out over the overgrown backyard and the fields beyond. Emma photographed the empty room, but as she was adjusting her tripod for a different angle, she heard something that made her freeze. The sound of the rocking chair moving, a slow rhythmic creaking as if someone were sitting in it, rocking gently back and forth. Emma turned to look at the chair. It was motionless, exactly as it had been when she entered the room, but the creaking continued for several more seconds before fading into silence. Emma convinced herself that the sound had been the old house settling, or perhaps the wind moving through the eaves. Old Victorian houses were notorious for the sounds they made, and she had heard similar noises in dozens of other properties she had photographed. But the sound had been so distinct, so rhythmic that it was difficult to dismiss. She finished the upstairs rooms quickly and moved back downstairs to complete the ground floor photography. The basement access was through a door in the kitchen, and Emma debated whether to include basement photos in her shoot. The listing sheet didn't specifically request them, and basements in old houses were often damp, cluttered spaces that didn't add much to a property's appeal. But Emma was a thorough professional, and she decided to at least take a look. The basement stairs were solid wood and they didn't creak as she descended into the lower level of the house. Her camera's flash illuminated the space below, revealing a surprisingly clean and well-organized basement. The previous owner had clearly used the space for storage and household tasks. There were neat shelves along one wall, filled with canning jars and gardening supplies. A workbench occupied another corner, its surface clean and organized with hand tools arranged in precise rows. And in the center of the basement was something that made Emma stop and stare. A small table had been set up in the middle of the concrete floor, covered with a white tablecloth and set for 2 people. 2 plates, 2 sets of silverware, 2 crystal wine glasses, and a pair of white candles in silver holders. The candles had been burned down to stubs and wax had pooled on the tablecloth around their bases. Emma approached the table cautiously, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck. The place settings were elegant but dusty, as if they had been arranged for a special dinner that never happened. One of the napkins had been unfolded and placed across a lap, while the other remained folded beside its plate. A wine bottle sat between the place settings, empty except for a dark residue at the bottom. The label was too faded to read, but Emma could see that it had once been an expensive vintage. 2 wine glasses showed similar residue, as if they had been filled and then left to evaporate over the course of months or years. Emma photographed the table from several angles, though she wasn't sure why. The basement dining setup certainly wouldn't be included in the listing photos, but something about the scene demanded documentation. It was so carefully arranged, so deliberately staged, that Emma felt as if she were looking at a piece of performance art rather than abandoned household items. As she was packing up her equipment, Emma heard footsteps above her head. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor of the living room. She stood perfectly still, listening to the sound of someone walking back and forth above her, their path taking them from the front of the house toward the back, then returning. Emma climbed the basement stairs as quietly as she could and emerged into the kitchen. The footsteps had stopped and the house was silent again. She walked through the ground floor rooms, checking each one carefully, but found no sign that anyone else was in the house. The front door was still closed and locked from the inside, exactly as Emma had left it. The windows were all latched shut. There was no other entrance to the house that Emma could see, and no indication that anyone had entered while she was in the basement. But as Emma was gathering her equipment to leave, she noticed something that made her heart race. The coffee mug that had been sitting on the kitchen counter was no longer there. Emma searched the kitchen carefully, checking the sink, the dishwasher, and the countertops. The mug had vanished. Emma left the house quickly, locking the front door and replacing the key in the lockbox. She drove away from 4247 Millfield Road with the uncomfortable feeling that she was being watched from the tall windows of the Victorian farmhouse. That evening, Emma developed her photos and prepared the digital files for the realtor. The images had turned out well, showcasing the house's Victorian charm and the potential of its spacious rooms. But as Emma reviewed the photos on her computer screen, she noticed something that she hadn't seen while taking them. In several of the interior shots, there appeared to be a figure in the background, not clearly visible, but suggested by shadows and the play of light through the rooms. In the living room photo, there was a dark shape near the staircase that could have been a person standing at the foot of the stairs. In the master bedroom, a reflection in the dresser mirror showed what might have been someone sitting on the edge of the bed. Emma adjusted the brightness and contrast of the images, trying to bring out more detail, but the figures remained tantalizingly unclear. They could have been tricks of light and shadow, or they could have been something else entirely. The realtor was pleased with Emma's work and scheduled the house for showings the following weekend. But Emma found herself thinking about the property long after she had submitted her final invoice. She couldn't shake the image of that carefully set table in the basement, or the sound of footsteps moving through empty rooms above her head. 3 weeks later, Emma received a call from her supervisor. The house on Millfield Road had been taken off the market. The potential buyers who had toured the property had all reported similar experiences. Doors that opened and closed by themselves, the sound of someone walking through the house at night, and the persistent feeling that they were not alone in the building. One family had been particularly shaken by their visit. They had brought their 8-year-old daughter with them, and the child had refused to enter certain rooms, claiming that the lady didn't want them there. When asked to describe the lady, the child had said she was elderly, wearing a long white dress, and that she seemed sad because she was waiting for someone who never came home. The realtor had done some research into the property's history and discovered that the previous owner, an elderly woman named Margaret Hartwell, had indeed died in the house. She had lived alone for the final 15 years of her life, after her husband had passed away from cancer. Neighbors reported that Margaret had never fully accepted her husband's death and had continued to set the table for 2 people every evening, as if he might return for dinner. Margaret had been found at the bottom of the basement stairs, where she had apparently fallen while carrying a tray of food down to what neighbors assumed was a root cellar or storage area. But when the police investigated, they found the elaborate table setting that Emma had photographed, complete with a meal that had been prepared for 2 people. The house was eventually sold to a developer who planned to tear it down and build a modern home on the property. But Emma heard through the local real estate network that the demolition crew had experienced their own problems with the site. Workers reported tools going missing, equipment malfunctioning for no apparent reason, and the persistent sound of someone calling out from inside the house. Even after the interior had been gutted, Emma never took another assignment in that part of the county. She told her supervisor that the drive was too long and the rural properties were too time-consuming to photograph efficiently. But the real reason was that she couldn't stop thinking about Margaret Hartwell, sitting alone in her empty house, setting the table for a husband who would never come home, waiting for a reunion that would only happen when death kindly stopped for her as well. Sometimes, Emma realized, the houses we leave behind hold more than just our belongings. They hold our hopes, our routines, and our refusal to accept that some things are truly finished. And sometimes, those houses aren't quite ready to let go of the people who filled them with life, love, and the quiet desperation of those who wait too long for someone to come home. The Victorian farmhouse on Millfield Road was eventually demolished, but Emma heard from other photographers that the new house built on the site had its own problems. The family who moved in reported that their dinner table was often found set for 2 people in the morning, even though only 3 people lived in the house. And sometimes, late at night, they could hear the sound of someone walking slowly through their modern rooms, as if searching for something that was no longer there. Story 3. The Forest Road. This final story comes from a man named Michael, or at least, that's what he called himself when he reached out to me. He was a long-haul trucker for most of his adult life, driving the highways and back roads of the Midwest in the deep hours when most of the world sleeps. Michael had seen strange things during his years on the road, things that happen in that liminal space between night and dawn, when the familiar world seems to shift into something altogether different. But nothing prepared him for what he encountered on a forgotten stretch of forest road in northern Wisconsin. On a night when the fog rolled in like a living thing and the trees seemed to whisper secrets that no human was meant to hear. It was late September, and Michael was driving a load of manufactured goods from Milwaukee to Duluth. He had been making this run for almost 15 years, and he knew every mile of the route by heart. The interstate would have been faster, but Michael preferred the state highways that wound through Wisconsin's northern forests. The traffic was lighter, the scenery was better, and the smaller roads reminded him of why he had fallen in love with trucking in the first place. Michael had left Milwaukee at 8 in the evening, planning to reach Duluth by dawn. The first few hours of the drive passed without incident. He made good time through the rolling farmland of central Wisconsin, stopping only once for fuel and coffee at a truck stop near Stevens Point. The weather was clear, and the harvest moon hung full and bright above the highway, casting everything in silver light. But as Michael drove deeper into the northern forests, the weather began to change. A fog started to form in the low-lying areas, wisps of white vapor that drifted across the road like ghostly fingers. At first, it was just occasional patches that his headlights could cut through easily, but as the night wore on, the fog grew thicker and more persistent. By midnight, Michael was driving through a world that seemed wrapped in cotton. The fog was so dense that he could barely see 50 feet ahead of his truck, and the familiar landmarks along the road had vanished into the white void. He slowed his speed to a careful crawl, relying on the yellow line in the center of the road to guide him through the murky darkness. Michael had driven in fog before, and he wasn't particularly concerned. Wisconsin's northern forests were known for their heavy fogs, especially during the autumn months when warm days gave way to cool nights. He would just have to take his time and stay alert. The schedule would have to wait, but as Michael continued through the fog, he began to realize that something was wrong. The road he was following didn't match his mental map of the route. He should have passed through the small town of Rhinelander by now. But there had been no signs, no streetlights, no indication of civilization. The road just continued to wind through the forest, mile after mile of curves and hills that didn't correspond to anything Michael remembered. Michael pulled over at what appeared to be a scenic overlook. Though the fog was too thick to see any scenery, he checked his GPS, but the device showed only a blank screen with the message, "Searching for signal." His cell phone had no service, and the CB radio produced nothing but static. Michael studied his road atlas by the dome light of his cab, trying to figure out where he might have made a wrong turn. But according to the map, there was only one major road through this part of the forest, and he had been following it faithfully. There should have been no way to get lost. He decided to continue driving, assuming that he would eventually reach a recognizable landmark or a town where he could get his bearings. But as the hours passed, the forest road continued to wind endlessly through the fog without any sign of civilization. Around 3 in the morning, Michael began to see lights through the fog. Not the steady glow of street lights or house lights, but flickering, dancing lights that appeared and disappeared among the trees. At first he thought they might be campfires left by hunters or campers who were spending the night in the forest. But as he watched the lights more carefully, he realized that they were moving. The lights drifted between the trees like lanterns carried by invisible hands. They appeared to be following the road, pacing Michael's truck as he drove slowly through the fog. Sometimes they would come close enough that Michael could almost make out their source, but they would always fade back into the mist before he could see clearly what was producing the illumination. Michael told himself that the lights were just reflections from his own headlights, bouncing off moisture in the fog and creating optical illusions, but the explanation didn't feel right. The lights moved too deliberately, too purposefully, as if they were being guided by some intelligence. As Michael rounded a sharp curve in the road, his headlights illuminated something that made him slam on the brakes. A figure was standing in the middle of the road, directly in the path of his truck. The figure appeared to be a woman, dressed in what looked like a long white gown or nightdress. She stood perfectly still, facing Michael's truck, her arms at her sides and her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to something. The fog swirled around her, but she remained clearly visible in the bright glare of Michael's headlights. Michael's truck came to a stop about 20 feet from the woman. He sat behind the wheel, his heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. The woman didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. She just stood there in the middle of the road, as if she belonged there. Michael rolled down his window and called out to her. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. She continued to stand motionless in the road, her white gown fluttering slightly in a breeze that Michael couldn't feel. He could see that she was barefoot and her long hair hung loose around her shoulders. Michael climbed down from his cab and walked slowly toward the woman. As he got closer, he could see that she was young, probably in her 20s, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the moonlight filtering through the fog. Her eyes were closed, and her face had a peaceful, almost serene expression. "Miss?" Michael said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you lost? Can I help you get somewhere safe?" The woman's eyes opened slowly, and Michael felt a chill run through his entire body. Her eyes were completely white with no pupils or irises visible. She looked directly at Michael, but it was clear that she couldn't see him. She was blind. But when the woman spoke, her voice was clear and melodious, with no trace of fear or confusion. "The road ends here," she said simply. "You can't go any further." Michael looked past the woman and saw that she was right. The paved road ended abruptly about 50 feet beyond where she stood. Beyond that, there was nothing but forest floor covered in fallen leaves and undergrowth. It was as if the road had been cut off, severed from whatever destination it was supposed to reach. "I'm trying to get to Duluth," Michael said, though he wasn't sure why he was explaining his situation to this strange woman. "I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. Can you tell me how to get back to the main highway?" The woman smiled, and her expression was both beautiful and deeply sad. "There is no way back," she said. "Not from here. The forest doesn't let people leave once they've come this far." Michael felt panic beginning to rise in his chest. He turned and looked back toward his truck, but the fog had grown even thicker, and he could barely make out the glow of his headlights. The road behind him seemed to have vanished into the white void. "I don't understand," Michael said, turning back to the woman. "This is just a state highway. I've driven through this area dozens of times." "No," the woman said gently. "You've never been here before. No one comes here by accident. The forest calls people, draws them in when they're ready." "Ready for what?" The woman gestured toward the trees around them, and Michael noticed for the first time that the flickering lights he had seen earlier were now surrounding them. Dozens of them, drifting between the trees like fireflies, creating a soft, ethereal glow that pushed back the darkness. "To join us," the woman said. "To become part of the forest. We've been waiting for you, Michael." Michael's blood went cold. He had never told the woman his name. "How do you know my name?" "We know everyone who comes here. We've been watching you drive this route for years, waiting for the right night. The night when the fog is thick enough, when the moon is full enough, when you're lonely enough to hear our call." Michael realized that the woman was right about one thing. He was lonely. He had been lonely for years, driving the highways by himself, sleeping in truck stop parking lots, eating meals from vending machines. His wife had left him 5 years ago, tired of being married to a man who was never home. His children had grown up and moved away, building lives that didn't include their absent father. The trucking life had once felt like freedom, but somewhere along the way, it had become a prison. Miles and miles of empty road, with no real destination, and no one waiting for him when he arrived. "You don't have to be alone anymore," the woman said, as if she could read his thoughts. "The forest is full of people like you, people who were lost, people who were traveling towards something they could never find in the outside world." Michael looked around at the dancing lights and realized that they weren't lights at all. They were people. Transparent figures moving between the trees, their faces peaceful and content. Men and women of all ages, dressed in clothing from different eras, all of them glowing with the same soft, ethereal light as the woman in the road. "We're not dead," the woman said, answering the question that Michael hadn't asked. "We're just here, in the space between the world you know and the world that exists beyond it. We've found what we were looking for." Michael felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. The panic and confusion were fading, replaced by a deep calm that he hadn't experienced in years. The fog seemed warmer now, welcoming rather than threatening. The forest around him felt like a place where he could rest, where the constant motion of the road could finally come to an end. "What about my truck?" Michael asked. "My cargo?" The woman smiled. "Someone else will take care of those things. Someone who still belongs to the world of schedules and deadlines. You don't need to worry about any of that anymore." Michael looked back toward his truck one last time. The headlights were still glowing in the fog, but they seemed very far away now, as if they belonged to someone else's life. He thought about the empty apartment waiting for him in Milwaukee, the dispatchers who would wonder where he was, the routine that had been his entire existence for the past 15 years. None of it seemed important anymore. "Will it hurt?" Michael asked. "No," the woman said. "It's like falling asleep after a very long day. You'll just let go of all the things that were weighing you down." Michael nodded and took a step toward the woman. As he did, he felt something release inside him, as if he were setting down a heavy burden that he had been carrying for years. The fog swirled around him, and he could feel himself becoming lighter, more transparent, more at peace. The woman reached out and took his hand, and Michael felt a warmth that he had almost forgotten existed. Around them, the other figures in the forest began to move closer, welcoming him into their eternal community of the lost and found. "What is this place?" Michael asked, as he felt his connection to the physical world beginning to fade. "It's the place where all roads lead," the woman said. "Eventually, when people have been traveling long enough, when they've been searching hard enough, they always find their way here. The forest has been collecting travelers for centuries. We're all part of the same journey now." Michael felt his feet leave the ground, and he realized that he was beginning to glow with the same soft light as the others. His truck, his cargo, his schedule, his empty apartment, his broken marriage, his absent children, all of it was drifting away like smoke in the wind. "Welcome home," the woman said, and Michael understood that she was right. This was home. This was the destination that every road had been leading to, the place he had been trying to reach without knowing it for his entire adult life. The fog closed around them, and Michael became part of the forest, part of the eternal community of travelers who had found their way to the road that ends in peace. Weeks later, Michael's truck was found by a Wisconsin State Patrol officer, abandoned on a Forest Service road about 30 miles north of Rhinelander. The engine was still running, the headlights still on, and the cargo was intact. There was no sign of the driver, and no indication of what had happened to him. The official report listed Michael as a missing person, and the case remained open for several years before being transferred to the cold case files. But local residents in that part of Wisconsin know that the northern forests have always had a way of claiming travelers who venture too deep into the wilderness on foggy nights. Sometimes during the autumn months when the fog rolls in heavy and white, drivers on the back roads report seeing lights moving between the trees, dancing, flickering lights that seem to follow their vehicles, as if guiding them toward something. Most people are smart enough to turn around, to head back to the main highways where the world makes sense and the roads lead to places that exist on maps. But occasionally, someone doesn't turn around. Someone who has been traveling too long, searching too hard, carrying too much loneliness in their heart. Someone who is ready to discover that not all journeys are meant to end in the places we think we're going. And in the forest, Michael waits with the others, holding lanterns made of moonlight and memory, ready to welcome the next traveler who finds their way to the road that leads finally, peacefully home.